and I slapped my arm as quickly and quietly as I could. While holding my hand over the alarm, I slowly turned to see if I'd woken my wife. Jane always managed to look pretty, even when she was sleeping. Well, not really, but she looked pretty to me. And I walked to the bedroom door on my way to the kitchen, making sure to avoid the creaky, aged planks that make up my bedroom floor. And I could practically step around them with my eyes closed. Jane has always loved the taste of fresh game. I could never understand what she liked about it, but I loved hunting, so it was a nice balance. I tried preparing the pots and plates as quietly as I could, but, they're plates and pots. I told myself she couldn't hear anything I was doing, and the surprise wouldn't be ruined, but I'm certain that I heard her trying to race back up the stairs quietly to spare my feelings. And after leaving the kitchen ready for the meal I would prepare later, I grabbed my beautiful bolt-action CZ rifle and left out the door. The outside world greeted me, the sky a single tone that mirrored itself as far east as west. The blinding white frost of cold winter morning created the illusion of distance as far as infinity, while simultaneously appearing completely flat and right in your face. A gentle breeze made sure my eyes never opened further than a squint, and I whistled at my lazy mutt, and he poked his head out of his luxurious doghouse. And I lowered my fist to him, and he used my knuckles to give himself a nice head massage. And I tucked my hand back into my pockets after the cold strips what little heat I had left. My faithful dog bit at my hand, annoyed that I had put it away, and I led him to the passenger side of my truck, opened the door for him, and he hopped in, and closing the door behind him with his jaws on the rag I had wrapped around the handle on the inside. And I walked over to the driver's side, and just before I ducked into the seat, I looked up to see her smiling at me from the second floor window. When I saw her, she flinched away, but quickly came back when she realized I'd already seen her. She gives me a bashful smile. I waved at her, shaking my head and chuckling. And I start the truck and regret not getting the heater fixed. Even on high, it's barely enough to allow me one hand on the wheel, while I warm up the other. At least she's a reliable rig. We cut through the fresh snow with ease on the main road, heading towards a nice hunting spot that I frequently visit. My dog had already buried himself in his smelly blanket and refused to come out, and I patted him over the blanket. "Come on, boy, haven't you slept enough?" He stubbornly gave me a soft woof. I reach into the glove box and pull out a package of dried venison, and I lay a piece next to his snout, and he briefly pokes his nose out to sniff and lick up the treat. And I rubbed his head and continued down the road until I reached my right turn. And after arriving, my dog and I left the truck and headed towards the tree line. And he immediately hopped off and found a tree to mark. And as I waited for him, I began to load up my rifle one round at a time. And the forest is oddly quiet, until I hear faint footsteps in the distance. And I squint my eyes and try to see what's causing the noise, and I see something coming towards us from the woods. I used my scope to get a better look at the animal, and I saw that a wolf was sprinting in my direction. Huh? I looked up further and saw an enormous pack of snarling wolves following closely behind the first. My eyes widened as an electric wave of shock sprang over my heart, and despite the biting cold, I broke out into a sweat. I hadn't even realized I dropped my bullets, and after they lightly landed on the ground, I had already turned to run for the truck, and stopping when I didn't see Bart following. And I must have stopped too quickly because my feet easily lost the ground, and I found it with my hands and nearly my face. And I got up as quickly as possible, ignoring my stinging hands. I ran back to Bart with the stampede of menacing black fur and white hungry teeth in the background, growing in size with each passing moment. You don't realize how large a wolf really is until you see one with your own eyes. And as soon as I could reach him, I grabbed his collar and yanked. He got the message and began following. We weren't far from the truck, but the wolves also weren't far from us. Their paws were dreadfully audible, and as I ran, I couldn't tell if the panting directly behind me was my own dog or the wild wolf. And I must have been panicking too much because after I reached the truck, I ended up on my ass again. Damn it, I explained as I missed the handle by mere inches. And I looked up and it was too late. There was no time to make it back to the truck. Bart stood over me like a lion. He braced for the gnashing claws of the fierce wolves, but the impact never hit. The wolves just ran over Bart and I, as if we weren't even there. They completely ignored us and continued running as a pack as if they were just caught up in a blazing forest fire and had made a temporary alliance with all life in the forest just to escape. And I watched them cross the main road I had turned in on. Their large frames shrunk to nothing in the vast empty canvas that blurred the lines between heaven and earth. The only discernible point of reference was the sun, faded behind clouds with no depth or shadow. And I sat there in silence for a moment, trying to calm my breath. Maybe the trees absorbed the wind. Maybe the snow muted the ambiance. But after the storm of wolves passed, the silence of the forest was unnerving. Still sitting on the ground, and I laughed to myself in terror as Bart licked my face trying to comfort me. And I gave him my knuckles and he scratched his head with them. Returning to where I dropped the bullets, I noticed that the divide between the forest and the rest of the world suddenly seemed greater. And I stood before the border of two worlds as I willingly stepped into one where I didn't belong. Walking through the forest, I looked up directly at the sun and felt no pain due to the clouds, evenly distributing its light everywhere. And it was still morning, but nearing noon. Bart found a scent, and I followed him. And eventually the scent became a small trail of blood that wasn't too unusual, but what I saw in the distance was. And I jogged ahead of Bart because he was still just focused on the trail in front of him. And I saw something in the trees. My gaze grew more intense with every step, and as a clearer picture revealed itself, to be another wolf hanging upright on a tree branch, with its innards on display, like some sick, mad scientist dissection experiment. Its skin was stretched out and pinned to the tree branches, as if someone was leaving the animal's skin out to dry. The corpse was still purging its scarlet fluids onto the massive blotch of foul, black-dyed snow below. My brow furrowed, and my face turned to a scowl in confusion and disgust. The pure white snow around the gory scene only made the colors seem more vibrant and clear. What the hell could have done this? Bart backed up with his tail between his legs, and I looked around some more and noticed the surrounding trees all had unrecognizable symbols roughly carved into them. I didn't know what to make of what I was seeing, and it was simply strange and disturbing, to say the least. We finally arrived at my little tree fort, hunting shack, shelter, and whatever you want to call it. And I built her right into a tall, strong tree. Bart jumped into the box I made for him, attached to a rope leading all the way up. And I climbed up first, using the ladder steps nailed right into the tree. And then I pulled the rope to bring Bart up with me. And the shelter was a small one. and standing upright in it was impossible, and if I laid down with my hands and feet stretched out, I could easily touch any of the side walls. Only one side of wall had an entire section of wood missing to show the view of the deeper part of the forest. The other walls could be opened with small, hinged hatches, acting as windows barely large enough to fit my head. There was a large camo tarp covering the biggest segment of the open wall to keep out the cold. We sat patiently and comfortably inside, protected from the unrelenting cold, but despite the gentle howling of the wind, the forest really was oddly quiet. And I hadn't realized how clearly I could hear my blood pulsing to the beat of my heart, until the silence was broken by a gentle knocking just behind my head. And immediately my veins froze over, my heart sank as my eyes grew. I tried to ease my growing heartbeat by thinking, it's probably just a loose branch. And I got up, hunched over, and looked at the hatch on the wall. And I hesitated as I began to raise my hands towards the lock, when another 3 knocks halted my movement. And a weak voice from either a young boy or a lady said, "Hello?" from the other side of the wall. And the adrenaline came back, and I worried somebody was out there freezing, in need of my help, but no, that couldn't be. How did they get up here? Have they been here for some time? Before I even arrived? Before I even arrived? Are they just hanging on the tree? No. And if someone was out there in need of help, they wouldn't be waiting outside a shelter. I would have found them in here when I came up. And I looked at Bart and was surprised he hadn't started barking. He stared at the wall intensely without moving. And I opened my mouth to respond to whoever was on the other side, but for some reason, my instincts were telling me to do as Bart was doing. He and I sat still, feeling like my heart was beating too loud. My body strained from being in an awkward position for too long, and it felt like any small movement would mean trouble, so I ignored the static in my legs as they fell asleep from being in a crouched position for so long. The silence was broken by the sound of frozen planks cracking under the weight of something on the roof. I hadn't sealed the roof as well as the walls, so there were slits where the planks joined. Light weakly pushed through, and whoever was out there began blotting out what little rays of light made it through their limbs. They began with one patch, covered as flakes of undisturbed snow, fell where the pressure was being applied. Then another landed as the first moved away to a new spot. Another 2 appeared behind the first 2. Whatever was out there was taking their time and crawling on all 4s. And I began to question whether I'd really heard a voice, nor if the silence of the forest had finally gotten to me. My lungs forgot how to work as I watched it continue across above us. And after it reached the edge of the shelter, there was one last creak, slightly more audible than the others. The shadows disappeared from the roof and briefly returned where the tarp was hiding us from the outside world. It had jumped. There was a thud on the floor below, muffled by the snow, then rapid footsteps that quickly decreased in volume. And I finally remembered to breathe again and made my way to the tarp. And I lifted it and looked out. Bart joined me in my search, but we only saw a small patch of upturned snow that broke the wavy, frozen, white ocean and footprints leading away from us. And I looked for a while longer before retreating back into the shelter. Bart decided to stand watch for me, and I quickly checked the hatch on the side wall where the knocking originated. sticking my head out, and I saw nothing unusual. And I locked it again and sat back down, still processing the odd occurrence. Had I really just heard a voice? And a few minutes later, Bart began softly barking at me, trying to bring my attention back outside. "What do you see, boy?" I asked while making my way over to him. And I squinted into the distance where he was looking, and I saw movement far away. By the collar of the animal, now I was fairly certain it was a deer. And I grabbed my rifle and put my scope in the animal's direction, and I saw a deer slightly hidden behind a tree. The shot wasn't ideal, but it was clear enough. For a moment, I had forgotten about all that happened up to this point, but I was quickly reminded that it wouldn't end there. And after focusing my sights on the deer, I noticed it wasn't quite standing, but not lying down either. And it was lightly convulsing, momentarily twitching, causing its limp, hanging head to rock in an unsettling way, as if its bones were disconnected, clung together by only flesh and muscle. And the deer appeared to be already damaged. Maybe a wolf got to it before, because part of its coat was hanging off of its body, and the fur was dyed red by its own blood. Not too long ago, I had just woken up, well rested with all my strength, but this day had worn me down emotionally. My mouth hung suspended, in motion to speak, but being unable to find the right words to ask, and no one was even around to hear me. That's right, no one was around to hear me. And I dropped the scope and looked down at the ground, in need of a break from this incomprehensible scene before me. And after taking a breath, I decided the deer was sick. I'd hunt it, but only to put it out of its misery. I had no intention of taking that back home with me. And I fixed the scope on the deer, and almost as soon as I did, I jumped when the deer's neck suddenly snapped back into place. Its head turned to aim its eyes right at me, and it felt for a split second like we had switched roles. Fear manifested as a shiver down my spine, amplifying the winter air around me. And I hastily planted the crosshairs on the deer's chest, as if to desperately take back the role of hunter, and pulled the trigger without focusing my shot. The banging echo of the gun cracked through the forest, bringing it to life for only a moment. In the blink of an eye, a black dot appeared on the deer's chest as the bullet ripped through its body. And the deer shook mildly at the bullet's impact, but otherwise it stood as a boulder. The wound didn't even bleed. With no other reaction, the deer simply turned its head and ran off, or at least it tried to run. I must have severed some sort of nerve, because the deer moved like how my dog would walk when I put shoes on his feet. Bart looked cute doing that, but this deer was simply uncanny. After the deer was long gone, I wondered if chasing it was a good idea. I didn't even want to touch it before, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Bart didn't like the idea, and whimpered as we first followed the footsteps of whatever was knocking on my shelter. And I noticed that those footsteps were oddly humanoid. They were in the direction of the deer that I had shot, so I studied them as I went. The walk seemed longer than it should have been, and I looked up at the sun. It was just past noon now. And I looked around at the still forest, half expecting to see more odd symbols etched into the bark. That would be creepy, I said out loud. Arriving where the deer had been when I shot it, I saw a gruesome scene. Despite the small hole, void of blood, that the bullet had made on the deer, the snow here was nearly completely melted away from the nauseating amount of blood that poured onto it. And there was a pile of shredded organs on the ground. Some bones littered the area, and others were still attached to the muscle. And there was even a skull there, all belonging to a deer, I assumed. Steam rose from the warm heap of deer guts, and I gagged after staring for too long. And questions raced through my mind. I don't know what it was that was pushing me to follow the deer, but whatever it wasn't common sense. And I was stupidly desperate for answers to questions I should have never asked. And at this point, the snow began to dance around me from the sky, and I had to move quickly before losing the trail. And Bart loyally but reluctantly followed behind me as we walked for nearly an hour in a direction I don't even think we walked before. And the footsteps were fading as the intensity of the snowfall increased. My vision was obscuring as the snow slowly became a mild blizzard. And I saw a large dark spot on the ground ahead of me. And after an hour of walking, the ground rose upwards until it became a hill where I stood. And the dark spot eventually revealed itself to be the mouth of a gaping cave. I was done at that point. I didn't feel it'd be worth it, and I didn't have time to go off on a side adventure with my wife waiting at home. Now it was already late, so I turned to leave, but something had caught me off guard. And I turned around to check if what I saw was reality. And the footsteps I had been following abruptly ended, and I was afraid to acknowledge I had been tricked. I looked around my surroundings, and where I stood was a treeless patch going over and around the cave. And I've heard of animals like foxes backtracking to avoid predators, but what kind of animal would use that to catch prey? And I looked to Bart for answers, and he was focused on the trees behind us. I turned back around and followed his gaze. The blizzard was giving the distance a white tint. Bart began growling and barking. His hairs stood on end at the thought of an unseen enemy. And I wouldn't have seen it if it hadn't moved. A single hand, with long, slim fingers wrapped around a tree far away, opened like a flower in bloom. And the tree was thick, and yet this thing had half his hand around it. I looked upwards and saw the silhouette of a head. The blizzard blurred the features on the thing, but I had seen enough. And I froze, hoping what I was seeing was just an illusion brought on by the blur of the blizzard. But I had to make sure. And those few seconds of stillness stretched into hours. And I steadied the gun on my shoulder, aiming at the now still figure. I had to know if there was something really there. Bart had been whimpering, and his cries increased exponentially as I aimed. And just as I fired the bullet, I felt an electric current shock my leg. I looked down and saw Bart biting my leg hard and tugging at me while whimpering like I'd never heard him do before. He threw off my shot, but I caught a glimpse of the figure recoiling as a misty red cloud burst from its shoulder. My eyes returned to the figure, and it was sprinting at me on all fours. This was no illusion, and I didn't wait to find out what his face looked like, undisturbed by a hazy storm. Bart led the way into the cave, and I followed without protest. My footsteps' echo grew as I pushed further into the darkness, and eventually, I found a boulder for me and Bart to take cover behind. I turned to the entrance and saw the silhouette of the figure pause there, standing on two legs. And I aimed my rifle again, and it ducked down, beginning to crawl. And I could no longer see it. All I saw was the bright outside world at the end of the tunnel. And I sat there, with Bart for a couple of minutes, just listening for any movement. The wind caused an almost whistle-like effect inside the cave, making it difficult to make out which sounds were real and what was in my imagination. And I decided it was best to keep the rifle in a defensive position, and as a shield, rather than hope that I'd have time to lock onto my invisible target, guided by sound alone. And I thought that my eyes were finally adjusting to the dark, and because I had convinced myself, I could see hints of the cave wall around me, and just barely, the outline of a tall, long-limbed humanoid figure. And it was just standing to my left, not too far away. And I don't understand why it hadn't attacked me yet. And I slowly aimed the rifle at it from my hip. And I cannot stress how slowly I moved, making sure my aim was flawless. My fingers slowly squeezed the trigger, and a split second before, mere inches away from my left ear, I heard the same weak hello. And I flinched as the bullet hit my imaginary enemy. The flash gave me a brief scope of the area. There was no cave. Now I was surrounded by trees, covered with odd symbols. My adversary had already gotten far too close to me, biding its time using the wind as a cover for its incremental movements in the dark. And I could hear it begin to make its move, but Bart miraculously tackled the thing before I, or it, could react. And the struggle began, and I heard my dog snarling angrily and the same human voice that said hello, except now it was howling like the souls of the damned. And I began yelling, not in fear or any emotion that I could easily describe. My voice just flowed without my permission. The monster's cries died out, but Bart was showing no mercy. He continued barking and snapping his jaw, tearing at whatever that thing was. And I've never heard Bart bark so intensely, and it was as if he stopped taking breaths in between barking and continued his assault. And I continued yelling as my ears began ringing, and after my lungs were empty, a warm glow drew my eyes, and I looked at my burning home. The flames raged on as I opened my mouth to release the emotional pressure in my voice. And I don't know if I ever made a noise. The ringing in my ears had began deafening my audible reality. And I was shaking even though I wasn't cold. The heat from the fire felt like it scorched the hairs from my face. My wife grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me violently. And I continued yelling in her face in a delirious state. And I stared at her, but I couldn't remember what her face looked like. She guided the rifle in my hands to her chest, while chanting something that I couldn't hear. I kept the rifle fixed on her, not knowing what else to do. She eventually walked away to the side of the house and got down on her knees. She began working on something on the floor, but I couldn't see what it was. The ringing in my head was unbearable. I couldn't explain any of my actions if I tried, but without hesitation, I lifted the barrel of my rifle to my chin and fired a round into my head. My world flashed, and I was plunged back into the dark reality of my situation. The transition shocked the air out of my lungs, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. When I caught my breath, I noticed Bart whimpering weakly, and I stepped towards where I heard him. "Bart, you okay, boy?" My voice quivered. I knelt down near his body, and he whimpered softly. And I lowered my fist to his head with tears in my eyes, and then I felt a fleshy, furless skull. And I recoiled before attempting to touch it again, and reaching my hand out to confirm, and again felt a fleshy body before me. And I jolted up and pulled the trigger, aiming at the spot where that thing was laying in front of me. And all I heard were clicks. I reloaded the rifle in a panic and attempted the trigger again, but there was one last whimper as the bullet struck it. I looked towards the entrance and called out for Bart. "Hey boy, where are you?" And he responded with a strong bark, and I saw a silhouette appear at the end of the tunnel, and I jogged to him, leaving the cave behind. Stepping outside, the world seemed darker than I remembered. Way too dark. And I searched for the sun where I last saw it, but it had disappeared. It was now hanging low on the other side of the sky. Evening. And how long was I in that cave for? Bart began walking ahead. I was eager to be done with this day, too. You leaving without me? Bart stopped and turned his head at me, and I stopped approaching him. What's wrong, Bart? He stared at me, and I noticed the wound on his coat. He wasn't in good shape, and a piece of his skin hung loosely around the belly area. Oh, you're hurt. I knelt down next to Bart and reached for him to check on his wound. When he barked violently at me and growled, and I sprung back up, throwing my hands in the air. Whoa, hey, Bart, it's okay, it's me. His growl faded and he began walking back. I watched him continue for a moment, still a little shocked that he had snapped at me. Eventually I jogged to catch up to him. I watched him carefully as we walked, and made sure to keep a distance behind him in silence. The sun was about to begin its setting phase, and we began our long walk back to the truck. I went into autopilot, watching the trees go by. We walked past my shelter in the trees, and then the corpse of the gutted wolf, until the sight of my truck in the distance returned my lucidity. My steps began to feel heavier the closer I got to my truck. My body tensed up as I put my hand on the door handle, and I just stood there, holding the door long enough to allow the cold metal to hold me back. Bart? And I turned to him as I spoke. I peeled my hand from the door and balled it into a fist, lowering it down to him. Come here, boy. His eyes stared at me. He stood immobile while my fist hung in the air waiting for reception. And eventually he slowly walked towards me and licked my fist. And I stood there clenching my jaw. My emotions turned to liquid and pushed against my eyes. And I slowly pulled my hand back and gripped my rifle tightly. And I closed my eyes, forcing tears down my cheek, and that provided me with brief relief from the cold, but quickly froze over, stinging my face worse than the air ever could. And I slowly lowered the barrel to that thing's head, and immediately it zipped away at astonishing speed. I let out a breath of short-lived relief until it turned left onto the main road in the direction of my home. I dashed to the driver's side and hopped in the truck, driving away recklessly. I sped down the road, disregarding the speed limit. With nothing else to do, and I tried to comprehend the horrors of this day, but that only left me feeling overwhelmed. I looked to my right at the passenger seat, the sight of flattened blankets, and put a pulsing pressure behind my eyes. And I lifted them, hoping a stubborn mutt would stick his nose out to greet me. My chest ached, but my body didn't allow me to shed any more tears. I couldn't even moan in pain, only release bursts of pathetic, gasping whimpers. Ignoring the roads, I shifted off to where the grass lay under the snow. When I saw my home in the distance, I glided towards my driveway as my car shook and bounced violently, and I would have crashed had there not been a pile of snow to slow me down. I threw the door open as I stood out in the cold of the growing darkness, and I saw my wife standing in the bedroom window, embraced in darkness, and she had one hand raised, waving at me. My muscles went limp, and I shook as the strength of my will bled from my very being. I calmly walked up the steps of my porch and pushed the door open that had already been left half ajar. And it was just as cold inside as it was out. I shut and locked the door behind me and made my way up the steps, making sure to hit every creaky floorboard until I reached my bedroom door. My hands rattled violently as I revealed more and more of the room, pushing the door open. The thing wearing my wife's skin waited for me to see it, adjusting the stolen skin as it slid over its skull like a cheap mask. Gripping the rifle in my shaky hands, I began to raise it to my chin. And that's when it jumped towards me, inserting its fingers into my right side like it was warm butter. And I don't remember falling, but I sat there against the wall, looking at my exposed ribs and heaving lungs. Somehow, I never lost my grip on the rifle. When I looked up at the thing, it had been momentarily blinded as the stolen skin shifted around its eyes in the commotion. And I somehow found the strength to get up on my feet with a horrible, gurgled grunt in my throat. I stumbled down the hallway to the hatch leading up to my attic, and I struggled to reach it with half of my torso muscles gone. Eventually, I brought the ladder down and climbed. I turned around, and the thing was still desperately trying to readjust my wife's face onto its own, like its very existence depended on having an identity, even if it wasn't its own. And I could see its bones shift, like they were each their own separate entity. And I continued up and locked the hatch when I was in the attic, and I stood leaning on the slanted ceiling around me with my rifle aimed at the hatch. And it banged on the hatch to the attic, each strike fully intending to pulverize the barrier. When it inevitably came up, I fired a round into its chest and confirmed my suspicion that a single round wouldn't do much, and especially in my limited time. And I got a good look at this demonic being, though. It seemed to have given up on my wife's face, and it showed what it was really made of. And its facial features writhed desperately changing shape, as if it were waiting for an input. The same went for the rest of its body, except for the parts where the stolen flesh hadn't fallen off. And I fired again, this time aiming at the water heater behind the thing. It hissed moments before the bright flash sent me against the wall. I felt the burn of the heat and cold simultaneously. The blaze burned the hairs off my face, and the cold behind me made them stand on end. And I was weightless for the few moments I spent falling. And I don't remember hitting the ground, but I woke up dazed. There was a patch of dirt unbothered by the snow on the side of the house, where a pretty red-leafed plant was growing next to me. And I was worried I'd crushed it with my fall. And the world was blurry, and seconds passed like minutes, and everything went dark as I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, and I heard the shrieking bellows of 1,000 souls, both human and animal. When I looked at the sources of the hellish cries, I saw dozens of contorted limbs writhing in the fire, and as the souls were freed from the demonic vessel, each of its heads displayed a unique skull, spazzing wildly as if it had forgotten what it originally looked like when it was birthed from the ranks of the bowels of hell. It began to run off aimlessly into the distance as its body fought with itself, unable to decide which direction to go, and was the last memory I could recall from the night that I lost everything. And now, I lay here, staring at a cheap, white-tiled roof, hooked up to a machine, and I can still feel my legs. The nurse say it's called phantom limb syndrome, and that it should go away or become mostly undetectable after the first year. And I hope to God that whatever this thing was, it died along with my wife and dog. But something tells me that it's still out there somewhere. I'm going to have to sell my land to pay for the medical expenses. But I can't ever truly leave until I know it's dead.